December 10th, 1986. A federal courtroom in Brooklyn. Paul Vario sits before Judge Joseph McLaughlin, unshaven, wearing a rumpled blue blazer that hangs off him like it belongs to someone larger. He falls limply into the chair. The man weighs somewhere between 250 and 300 pounds, but it's dead weight now, all of it pulling downward. His attorney, Joe Winograd, he stands and tells the court that any sentence imposed on his client is effectively a death sentence. Vario is 72 years old. He has chronic heart disease. He has chronic obstructive lung disease. He can barely hold himself upright. The judge is not moved. The conviction is for extorting the airport Vario controlled for 3 decades. JFK, the single most lucrative cargo theft corridor in American organized crime. And the sentence is 10 years. Vario doesn't react. The man who never spoke above a whisper has nothing left to whisper about. His empire is already gone. The person who destroyed it is the same person who once called him uncle. Most people think they know this man. They don't. They know Paul Cicero, the character Martin Scorsese built from him for 1990's Goodfellas, played by Paul Sorvino with the quiet gravity of a man who sang opera in his spare time. Cicero is dignified, restrained, and a background patriarch in Henry Hill's story whose violence is only ever implied. The real Paul Vario was none of these things. Federal prosecutors called him one of the most violent and dangerous career criminals in the city of New York. He ran an empire generating an estimated $25,000 a day across airport cargo theft, construction union extortion, gambling, and loan sharking, an operation the film never depicted because the film wasn't his story. It was Hill's, and Hill, or whatever else he was, understood that people would rather watch him snort cocaine and chase cocktail waitresses than watch a 250-pound man in a junkyard in Canarsie whisper instructions that moved money across 5 boroughs. The real Paulie was uglier than the movie, more violent, more operationally sophisticated, and more human. This is who he actually was. According to Hill, and nearly everything known about Vario's private world comes through Hill, in a fact worth holding in mind, Paulie's speech consisted of short, grunt-like responses he whispered in public. He didn't believe in conferences. Nicholas Pileggi, who spent years interviewing Hill for the book Wise Guy, wrote that Paulie didn't want anyone hearing what he said, and he didn't even want anyone listening to what he was being told. He never used a telephone. Not occasionally. Never. And he feared electronic surveillance with a paranoia that turned out to be completely justified. Law enforcement bugged his trailer in 1972 and recorded 6 months of business he thought was private. Even his boat, docked in Sheepshead Bay, had no name. Everything about the man was organized around not being known. And yet he moved through the world with an unhurried arrogance that Hill captured in a single sentence that Scorsese liked enough to put in the film almost verbatim. Paulie may have moved slow, but it was only because Paulie didn't have to move for anybody. He stood approximately 6 feet tall with a narrow bone structure that made his 250 to 300 pounds look even heavier. Jowls hanging below his chin, a face multiple sources compared to a sumo wrestler or a ferocious bulldog. He was considered a glutton, reportedly tipping plates to his face to eat. His pasta e fagioli was renowned in the neighborhood as the best in New York. The famous prison cooking scene in Goodfellas, Paulie slicing garlic with a razor blade so thin it liquefied in the pan, comes directly from Wise Guy and is, by all accounts, one of the few details the film rendered accurately. He called stolen credit cards Muldoons and would request them from Hill whenever he and his wife Phyllis went out for dinner, because, as Pileggi documented, liquor tastes better on a Muldoon. He told people he was a florist. One of his legitimate businesses was a flower shop. the Fontainebleau florist on Fulton Street. For Paulie, the best part of the night came from the fact that he was getting over on somebody. The violence beneath those habits was not implied, and it was documented and specific. When a maitre d' at Don Pepe's Vesuvio restaurant spilled wine on Phyllis's dress and tried to clean it with a dirty rag, Vario overturned the table and began slapping the man. The maitre d' fled into the kitchen. Vario didn't follow him, not immediately. He sent 2 carloads of men armed with pipes and baseball bats to return after the restaurant closed and beat the staff. Hill, who participated, recalled the logic simply, "It was so easy. Lump them up. Whack them out." Nobody ever thought, why? What for? When one of Vario's mistresses, a barmaid, threatened to tell Phyllis about their affair, Vario drove to the woman's apartment, retrieved a baseball bat from the trunk of his car, and broke her collarbone. A 12-year-old Henry Hill watched him do it. The distance between this man and the one Paul Sorvino portrayed is the distance between a document and a performance. Sorvino gave you someone you could admire from a careful distance. The real Paulie didn't leave you that distance. The part of his story that makes the least sense, the part Goodfellas never mentioned, is that this man didn't start building his empire until he was nearly 50 years old. In 1937, at approximately 23, Paul Vario and an associate named Anthony Romano were convicted of raping a 16-year-old girl from Howard Beach. The sentence was 10 to 20 years at Sing Sing. He was paroled twice during that sentence and sent back both times, once for burglary, once for dealing stolen property. He wasn't fully released until 1962. Do the math, and it's staggering. Vario spent roughly 25 years cycling through incarceration before his major criminal career even began, a quarter century. The man the FBI would later call one of New York's most dangerous criminals spent most of his youth and all of his middle age behind bars or on parole from bars. It's the kind of biographical detail that changes how you understand everything that came after. The urgency, the appetite, the refusal to slow down once he finally had the world in front of him. What he had while he was locked away was a family already embedded in the infrastructure he'd need. The Varios were 5 brothers, all born to Pietro and Mary Vario, Sicilian immigrants from Eris, and all of them were in the life. Leonard, the eldest, worked as a construction union official and ex-bootlegger. He'd been arrested once with Lucky Luciano. By the time Paul came home, Leonard was already serving as his liaison to local building contractors and construction company managers, all of whom, as Pileggi documented, paid tribute in either cash or no-show jobs to guarantee that their building sites would remain free of both strikes and fires. Thomas, the next brother, he was a union delegate for construction workers who oversaw bookmaking and loan sharking at dozens of building sites simultaneously. Salvatore, they called him Babe, was a made member of the Lucchese family in his own right. He ran floating card and dice games, bribed police, and served as acting capo for Paul's crew during the years Paul was behind bars. And Vito, Tuddy, had lost a leg in the Korean War, ran the cab stand and the Presto Pizzeria on Pitkin Avenue day to day, and was the man who first spotted an 11-year-old Irish-Italian kid named Henry Hill looking for work across the street. 5 brothers, every one of them positioned in either construction unions, gambling, or the Lucchese family command structure. When Paul Vario finally walked out of prison for the last time in 1962, he didn't have to build an empire from nothing. The scaffolding was already standing. What he built on top of it, the airport operation, the systematic extortion, the machine that made $25,000 a day since he built in the years he had left, with the efficiency of a man who'd already lost 25 of them. The center of Vario's world wasn't the cab stand Goodfellas made famous. It was a junkyard. Vario's Bargain Auto Parts Incorporated, 5702 Avenue D, Canarsie, a compound surrounded by a 14-foot steel fence topped with barbed wire, patrolled by German shepherds, and anchored by a trailer where Vario conducted every piece of business that mattered. The film replaced this entirely with the Pitkin Avenue cab stand, which was real but secondary. The storefront where Tuddy handled street-level operations and where Hill first wandered in as a kid. The junkyard was the headquarters. The trailer inside it was the office. And the reason law enforcement spent years trying to get a listening device inside that trailer is that Vario ran his entire operation from it without ever writing anything down, signing anything, or picking up a phone. The operation that ran through that trailer had the precision of a logistics company. At JFK Airport, formerly Idlewild, the Lucchese family had maintained influence since the airport opened, and Vario's Brooklyn crew was geographically positioned to exploit it. Insidemen, right? Corrupt airport employees like cargo supervisor Robert Frenchy McMahon and Lufthansa cargo agent Louis Werner Enemer identified valuable shipments and their schedules. They passed intelligence to Jimmy Burke's hijacking crew, who intercepted cargo trucks on the highways near the airport. Burke paid drivers $50 to cooperate, the signature generosity that earned him the nickname Jimmy the Gent, and the stolen goods were unloaded at a Vario-controlled warehouse, where Burke personally inventoried the contents before dispatching them to street-level fences connected to the Lucchese family. Each truckload netted between $10,000 and $100,000. At peak operations, Burke's crew was hitting 2 to 3 trucks a week. That was only the theft side. Running parallel was a systematic extortion racket against the air cargo companies themselves. Vario used his influence over the cargo haulers union to threaten labor disruptions, trucks that wouldn't move, shipments that would sit on the tarmac, unless companies paid monthly protection money of $1,000 to $2,000 per firm. Between the early 1970s and the mid-1980s, this operation extracted an estimated $1.8 million from at least 6 air freight companies. His 1985 federal indictment charged him and his co-conspirators with extorting over $350,000 from JFK air cargo firms alone. FBI wiretaps from the early 80s captured Lucchese family members saying it flatly, "We own JFK." The airport was the crown jewel, but it wasn't the whole empire. The Vario brothers' construction rackets ran through Mason Tender's locals 4648 and 66. Every contractor in their territory paid tribute in cash or no-show jobs to keep building sites free of strikes and fires. The no-show jobs doubled as parole cover for crew members. Hill carried a bricklayer's union card that paid him $190 a week to never lay a brick. Vario's gambling operation controlled nearly all illegal betting in East New York, policy numbers, bookmaking, underground card games. One of the basement of the Presto Pizzeria on Pitkin Avenue served as the accounting room for his policy bank. When a local mobster named Jake Colombo died in 1965, Vario absorbed his gambling operations in the Cedarhurst and Inwood sections of Long Island within days. Loan sharking operated at standard mob vigorish, 1 to 5% per week, which works out to 52 to 260% annually, with violence as the only collection mechanism anyone needed. Hill started collecting bets and loan payments from construction sites for Vario at 14 years old. Add it together and the picture is an estimated $25,000 a day flowing through multiple revenue streams: airport theft, airport extortion, construction shakedowns, gambling, loan sharking, all controlled by a man who never used a telephone, never signed a document, and never raised his voice above a whisper. Hill described the system in terms that sounded medieval. Hundreds of guys depended on Paulie, and he got a piece of everything they made. And it was tribute, just like in the old country, except they were doing it here in America. The machine was built to be invisible. What proved it worked wasn't the daily revenue. It was the scores. April 7th, 1967. Henry Hill and Tommy Desimone walk into the Air France cargo terminal at JFK carrying an empty suitcase. They walk out with $420,000 in cash, thus the largest cash robbery in American history at that time. The money consisted of American currency exchanged in Southeast Asia, returned weekly by Air France for deposit with American banks, carried in linen bags containing approximately $60,000 each. 7 bags, 1 suitcase. The operation was elegant because it was built on the infrastructure Vario's crew already had in place. Inside man Frenchie McMahon, the Air France night shift cargo supervisor, tipped Hill about the shipments. Their size, their timing, their location inside the terminal strong room. The only obstacle was a single key held by a security guard. McMahon introduced the guard to an expensive escort at the Jade East Motel near JFK. Over multiple encounters, Hill copied the key from the guard's pants while the man was otherwise occupied. On April 7th, McCurry, with McMahon's intelligence confirming that between $400,000 and $700,000 would arrive for a Friday shipment, Hill and Desimone posed as passengers retrieving lost baggage, entered the strong room with the duplicate key, loaded the 7 bags, and left. No alarm was triggered. No guard was harmed. The theft wasn't discovered until the following Monday when a Wells Fargo truck arrived to collect cash that was no longer there. No one was ever charged. No one was ever prosecuted. Hill paid approximately $60,000 to Vario as tribute from the score. Roughly 12.5% of everything or for doing nothing except being Paulie. That was the arrangement. Vario didn't plan the job, didn't execute it, didn't touch the money until his cut arrived. He provided the infrastructure, the inside men, the airport access, the Lucchese family sanction that meant no other crew would interfere. And in return, he took his piece of everything that moved through his territory. The Air France job proved the system worked. The system had been working for years. But the person who made it work best, or the earner Vario trusted most, the kid he'd taken in and raised inside his world, was also the person who would eventually end it. The story of Henry Hill and Paul Vario is the story Goodfellas told, but the version the film told was Henry's. The version that matters here is Paulie's. And from Paulie's side, it's the story of a man who built a family around someone he could never fully make part of it. In 1955, an 11-year-old Hill wandered into the cab stand across the street from his family's apartment at 392 Pine Street in East New York, looking for after-school work. Tuddy Vario put him to work running errands. Paul Vario introduced the kid to the crew as his nephew, a designation that in that world meant something specific. It meant protection. It meant obligation. It meant the kid belonged to Paulie. Hill was half Irish, half Sicilian, which meant he could never be made, never inducted as a full member of the mafia. But Vario valued him enormously as an earner and, according to everything Hill later said, treated him with genuine paternal warmth. By 14, Hill was collecting bets and loan payments from construction sites using a union card the Varios had arranged for him. By 16, he and Vario's son Lenny were arrested together for using a stolen credit card to buy snow tires for Tuddy's wife. Hill gave the police nothing, only his name. When he came back, the crew gave him a hero's welcome. It was Vario who arranged the 1965 double date, Hill accompanying Paul Vario Jr., where Hill met Karen Friedman, the woman he'd marry. The film changed that detail. In Goodfellas, it's Tommy Desimone who sets up the date. In life, it was Paulie's own son. When Hill went to prison at Lewisburg in the early 1970s, Vario was already there. They were housed on the same corridor, Mafia Row, where imprisoned mobsters enjoyed wine, cooked meals with ingredients smuggled in by guards, and maintained a quality of life that had little in common with federal incarceration. The garlic sliced with a razor blade so thin it liquefied in the pan. That's from Lewisburg. Lucchese soldier Johnny Dio served as the cook. When Hill was released, Vario arranged a fictitious restaurant job through nightclub owner Philly Basile to satisfy his parole conditions, a favor that would later become the basis for one of Vario's own federal convictions. Every step of Hill's adult life had Vario's hand underneath it. The kid from across the street owed everything to the man in the junkyard trailer. What Goodfellas left out, the detail that changes the entire emotional geometry of this story, is that while Hill was imprisoned at Lewisburg, Vario began a sexual relationship with Karen Hill. Hill confirmed this years later in his 1994 book Gangsters and Goodfellas, but omitted it from the original Wise Guy, the book the film was based on. It's the most explosive personal detail in the entire Vario story, and the film never touches it. Though a single line of dialogue, where Cicero tells Hill he knows how to talk to Karen, especially to her, has been interpreted by some as a coded acknowledgement. The affair would have consequences that reached far beyond the personal. When Tommy Desimone later attempted to rape Karen while Henry was in prison, Vario's rage wasn't just the anger of a capo whose associate had violated another associate's wife. It was personal. And Desimone would pay for it with his life. The private cost of Vario's world fell hardest on the people closest to him, and no one paid more than his son. July the 20th, 1973. Leonard Lenny Vario, approximately 27 years old, was brought to the entrance of Wyckoff Heights Medical Center in Brooklyn by unknown men who immediately vanished. He was wearing nothing but charred shorts. Burns covered 90% of his body. The official cause of the burns was never publicly determined, but Hill later revealed that Lenny had sustained them while attempting an arson job, setting fire to the Vic Construction Company on Randolph Street. The accelerant caught, and Lenny adhered to omerta to the end. He never cooperated. He never named anyone. He died at the hospital without breaking the silence his father had built his entire life around. At his funeral, held at St. Fortunata's Church, mourners beat 2 television cameramen and a police detective who came too close. The family grieved the way the family did everything violently and behind a wall. If you're still with me on this one, a subscribe would mean a lot. Because the people whose fates Vario sealed next, Jimmy Burke and Tommy Desimone, are where the story everyone thinks they know starts to look nothing like what actually happened. Jimmy Burke, Jimmy Conway in the film, was the most valuable earner Vario ever had and the one he could never fully own. Burke was Irish-American, raised in foster homes and orphanages, which meant the same rule that applied to Hill applied to him. He could never be made. He'd always be an associate, and he operated a semi-independent hijacking crew out of Robert's Lounge at 11445 Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park, Queens, strategically positioned near JFK's Air Cargo Center, close enough that his crew could hit a truck and be back at the bar before the driver finished reporting it. Burke personally ripped open hijacked trailers to inventory their contents. He took proceeds and kicked a percentage up to Vario, who kicked a percentage up to Lucchese family leadership. The relationship was symbiotic in the way these things always are until they aren't. Vario provided the organizational sanction, the union connections, the protection of a mafia name. Burke provided muscle, planning, and results. Neither man could operate at full capacity without the other. Neither man fully trusted the other either. Tommy Desimone was a different kind of problem. Born June 6, 1946, into deep criminal lineage. His uncle was Los Angeles crime family boss Frank Desimone. Tommy started working under Vario's crew in 1965 at 19 years old. Hill described him as a skinny kid in a wise geek suit and a pencil mustache who carried his gun in a brown paper bag during hijackings like he was bringing you a sandwich instead of a .38. He was gifted at the work. He was catastrophic at everything else. On June 10th, 1970, Desimone murdered Gambino family maidman William Billy Bats Bentvena at Henry Hill's restaurant, The Sweet. Goodfellas depicted this as a spontaneous eruption. Bats mocking Desimone over shining shoes as a kid, Desimone snapping. The real murder was premeditated. Burke wanted Bats's loan shark business, and the insult gave Desimone the personal motivation to do what Burke needed done. And it was a capital violation of mafia law, sirs. Killing a maidman without authorization from the family that made him. Desimone later killed Ronald Foxy Giroux, a protege of John Gotti, in December of 1974. Another unauthorized murder. Another debt accumulating against him in a system that kept meticulous accounts of exactly this kind of thing. The debt came due because of Karen Hill. When Desimone attempted to rape Karen while Henry was imprisoned, Vario's response carried a fury that went beyond protocol. He was involved with Karen himself. The attempted rape was an assault on a woman Vario considered in some private and possessive sense his own. He went to the Gambino family directly and revealed Desimone's responsibility for the Billy Bats murder and the Foxy Giroux murder, both of which the Gambinos had been unable to resolve. In late December 1978 or early January 1979, Desimone was told he was going to be made. The ceremony was finally happening. Vario's son Peter and associate Bruno Facciolo picked him up. They drove him somewhere. He never arrived at any ceremony. His wife Angela reported him missing on January 14th, 1979. His body has never been found. He was declared legally dead in 1990. Hill later claimed on the Howard Stern show in 2007 that John Gotti personally killed Desimone. But that account has never been verified by any independent source. What's verified is that Vario gave him up. The man who built everything on loyalty betrayed his own crew member to a rival family. And the reason, underneath the organizational justification, was personal. 3 weeks before Desimone disappeared, the system Vario had built produced the score it had been designed for. December 11th, 1978. The intelligence chain ran from Lufthansa cargo worker Peter Grunewald to his co-worker Louis Werner, who owed $20,000 in gambling debts to bookie Martin Krugman, to Hill, to Burke, to Vario. Burke called Vario in Florida. According to a 1979 New Yorker account, Vario's instruction was blunt. Do it, and get me Burke. Vario needed cash. He'd recently lost approximately $1.5 million on a cocaine shipment seized by the DEA in Queens. At 3 a.m. on December 11th, 6 masked men entered Lufthansa's Building 261, took 9 to 10 employees hostage, forced night cargo manager Rudy Eirich through a sophisticated double-door vault system, loaded 72 cartons of cash and jewelry into a van, and drove away at 4:21 in the morning. $5 million in cash, $875,000 in jewelry. 64 minutes from entry to exit, the largest cash robbery in American history. Vario sent his son Peter to personally collect his share, estimated at $2 to $3 million. The aftermath revealed something the system wasn't designed to handle: Burke's paranoia. Convinced that anyone who knew about the heist was a potential witness, Burke began killing the people who'd helped pull it off. And Parnell Stacks Edwards, shot 5 times in the head 7 days after the robbery for failing to dispose of the getaway van. Martin Krugman, disappeared January 6th, body never found. Louis and Joanna Kafora flaunted their new money by buying a pink Cadillac, then vanished. Robert McMahon and Joe Budamanri, shot execution style, found in a parked Buick. Paolo Licastri, the Gambino family's observer on the job, found naked, shot, and burned. On Teresa Ferrara in May, dismembered and dumped in a New Jersey river. At least 8 people connected to the Lufthansa heist were murdered in the months that followed. The stolen cash and jewelry have never been recovered. Only $20,000 was ever seized from Werner, the sole person convicted of the robbery itself. The peak of Vario's empire and the beginning of its destruction were the same event. The money from Lufthansa didn't build anything. It left a trail of bodies and a paranoia that would reach Henry Hill within 18 months. Vario had one rule that he enforced above all others: no drugs. He explicitly prohibited his crew from trafficking narcotics, not out of moral conviction, but out of operational logic. Drug dealing attracted disproportionate law enforcement attention. Drug addicts made desperate informants. The math was simple. The risk outweighed every possible return. Hill ignored the prohibition entirely after his 1978 parole. He built a wholesale operation in marijuana, cocaine, heroin, and Quaaludes using contacts he'd made in prison. He was using as heavily as he was dealing, a cocaine addiction that by 1980 had consumed whatever judgment he'd once possessed. When Vario discovered what Hill was doing, he didn't negotiate. He didn't warn. He severed the relationship. According to Hill, Vario gave him $3,200, a final payment, an ending rendered in the specific figure that men in that world used to say, "You are no longer mine," and cut him loose. April 27th, 1980. Hill was arrested on narcotics charges. The case against him was built on thousands of wiretaps accumulated by NYPD narcotics detectives Daniel Mann and William Broder. Hill was looking at a sentence long enough to guarantee he'd die in prison. And then the FBI played him a tape. On the recording, Jimmy Burke tells Vario that they need to have Hill whacked. Associates Angelo Sepi and Anthony Stabile are heard telling Burke that Hill is no good, that he's a junkie. The surrogate nephew, the kid Paulie had introduced as his nephew at 11, the kid he'd raised inside his world, protected, employed, fed, taught, and trusted for 25 years, sat in a room and listened to his mentor agree to his murder. Hill signed a cooperation agreement with the Department of Justice Organized Crime Strike Force on May 27, 1980. Prosecutor Edward McDonald, who later played himself in the film, offered an assessment of Hill that captured the precise structural flaw in Vario's empire. Vario and Burke adored him. They'd never trust him with any important jobs. But he was fun and charming, and they loved having him around at shit, which meant he knew everything about all the various crimes they were committing. Hill's testimony produced 50 convictions. 50! The kid from across the street dismantled an organization that had taken 3 decades to build. Vario never made a public statement about the betrayal, never gave an interview, never spoke to a journalist or a prosecutor or a camera. Now, the man who'd built everything on silence maintained it to the end, though by then it was less a discipline than an empty room. Vario's drug prohibition was designed to prevent exactly this: an associate dealing, getting arrested, getting desperate, cooperating. It worked on paper. It failed in practice because the man most likely to break the rule was the man Vario kept closest, and kept closest precisely because he loved him. Was Vario right that drugs would destroy his world? Or was the empire already carrying its own destruction in its structure, built on men who could never be made, who would never have the full loyalty of membership, who would always be one bad arrest away from choosing survival over silence? I'd like to know what you think. Tell me in the comments. The convictions came in a cascade. In 1984, defrauding the federal government, the charge built on the fictitious restaurant job Vario had arranged through Philly Basile as a favor to Hill's parole conditions, 4 years and a $10,000 fine. The favor that was supposed to keep Hill close became the first conviction that pushed Vario toward death in a cell. 1985. The Kenrack investigation. Kennedy Airport racketeering. Charging Vario with extorting JFK air cargo companies. 10 years. In 1986, federal racketeering, a plea deal. 6 more years and a $25,000 fine. The December 10th sentencing before Judge McLaughlin, what the scene this story opened on was the racketeering plea. The rumpled blue blazer. The limp fall into the chair. The attorney arguing that the sentence is a death sentence. Winograd was right, though it wasn't the sentence that killed him. The lungs were already failing. Vario was transferred to the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas. 1,500 miles from Brooklyn, from Canarsie, from the junkyard and the trailer in the streets he'd controlled since 1962. On the afternoon of May 3, 1988, he was found unconscious on the floor of his cell. He was rushed to St. Joseph Hospital. At 5:04 in the afternoon, he was pronounced dead. The official cause was respiratory arrest resulting from chronic obstructive lung disease, with lung cancer as a contributing factor. He was 73 years old. Prison officer Alice D. Davis provided the statement. The New York Times published the obituary 2 days later. Paul Vario, 73, called a leader of crime group. 600 words. A man who controlled an empire generating $25,000 a day. Reduced to a dependent clause in a headline that couldn't even bring itself to name what he led, the landscape he built on has been almost entirely erased. The Pitkin Avenue cab stand, the paint-flecked storefront, where an 11-year-old Henry Hill first stepped into the life, is gone. The site now sits behind a high fence, occupied by a cell phone accessory store. Vario's Bargain Auto Parts at 5702 Avenue D in Canarsie, the junkyard, the trailer, the 14-foot fence. The German Shepherds houses a transit management company. Robert's Lounge at 114-45 Lefferts Boulevard in South Ozone Park, where Burke ran his hijacking crew and held court over the Lufthansa money, still physically stands. It operates as a Caribbean restaurant and karaoke bar. In June of 1980, police excavating the basement found a human leg bone and a shoulder bone believed to belong to murdered Lufthansa heist participants. The bocce courts in the backyard had reportedly served as burial grounds. The crew Vario built was absorbed and restructured. Alphonse Little Aldarco was promoted to lead it, rose to acting boss of the entire Lucchese family, and then turned government witness himself in 1991, fearing that boss Vic Amuso wanted him dead. The Canarsie crew was eventually merged with the Bensonhurst crew under Capo Regime Domenico Danny Cutaya. The empire didn't survive its founder. It didn't even survive the generation that came after. St. John Cemetery, Middle Village, Queens. The Vario family plot sits near the front of the smaller section behind the first line of mausoleums. The headstone bears a single name, Vario, with inscriptions for Paul, for his brothers Thomas, Leonard, and Salvatore, for his father Pietro, for his son Leonard, for his wife Phyllis. In August of 2019, Paul Vario Jr. was buried beside his father. He died peacefully in Delray Beach, Florida at 81, after a 58-year marriage to Marcia Vario. His obituary at Scarpacci Funeral Home described a devoted grandfather they called Papa, a man who loved cooking pasta and gardening. It didn't mention organized crime. It didn't mention Brooklyn or Canarsie or JFK or the name Henry Hill. The headstone carries everything the obituary chose not to say. The name is enough. It was always enough. Paulie made sure of that.